first time one of my own employees asked me to empty the trash, I smiled and said, "Of course." Not because I had to, because I wanted to know exactly who they became when they believed no one important was watching. Looking back now, I realized that morning changed my company forever. My name is Victoria Hayes. I'm 52 years old, and 15 years ago, I started Hayes Dynamics with a folding table, a borrowed laptop, and every dollar I had left after selling my house. Today, the company is worth hundreds of millions. What nobody inside the headquarters knew was that I still owned 68% of it. Officially, I had stepped away 3 years earlier after a serious heart condition forced me to slow down. The board announced that I was taking an extended leave while professional executives handled day-to-day operations. The truth was much simpler. I wanted to know whether the culture we had built could survive without my name hanging over every decision. For years, every quarterly report looked perfect. Revenue climbed, profits grew, investors were thrilled. Yet something about those reports bothered me. Numbers tell stories, and these numbers felt empty. Employee turnover was rising, customer satisfaction had begun slipping, innovation had stalled. The company looked healthy from the outside. Inside, something was slowly dying. Whenever I questioned the executive team, I received polished presentations, colorful charts, and reassuring speeches. Everything is under control. It's just post-pandemic adjustments. The market is changing. I had heard too many excuses in my career to believe polished answers, so I decided to look for unpolished ones. Instead of announcing another executive audit, I created my own. Only my attorney, my personal assistant Linda, and the chairman of the board knew. Everyone else, including the CEO I had personally hired, believed I was still recovering quietly at my ranch in Montana. 3 weeks later, I walked into Hayes Dynamics headquarters, wearing gray work pants, worn sneakers, blue latex gloves tucked into my back pocket, and a navy polo shirt with the logo of Skyline Facility Services. The cleaning contractor we had recently hired had agreed to help me. Their owner happened to owe me a favor from years ago. According to every employee badge in the building, I wasn't Victoria Hayes anymore. I was simply Margaret, temporary janitor, 6-week assignment. The security guard barely glanced at me before waving me inside. No one recognized me. That surprised me less than it should have. Most of the people working there had joined after my public retirement. To them, I was just an old photograph hanging near the lobby, a founder from another era, someone whose story appeared during orientation videos before being forgotten by lunch. The building itself looked beautiful. Glass walls, modern furniture, fresh flowers, digital displays celebrating company achievements. Everything appeared exactly the way investors love to see it. But companies aren't built in lobbies. They're built in conversations, in hallways, in break rooms, in the moments people think don't matter. I started on the 17th floor, where the executive offices overlooked the Chicago skyline. As I pushed my cleaning cart down the hallway, 2 managers walked past without even noticing me. "I swear," one of them laughed, "the support staff has gotten slower every month." The other shrugged. "They're cleaners. They're replaceable." Neither lowered his voice. Neither imagined the woman wiping fingerprints off the conference room glass had signed both of their employment contracts years earlier. I kept cleaning. People reveal themselves fastest when they think you're invisible. Around 10 o'clock, I entered one of the smaller conference rooms. Coffee cups covered the table. Someone had left confidential financial documents scattered across several chairs. That alone violated at least 3 internal security policies. I quietly placed the papers into organized stacks before continuing my work. A sharp voice interrupted me. "Hey." I turned. A young executive I'd never met stood in the doorway without looking away from his phone. He couldn't have been older than 35. Perfect suit. Designer watch. Expensive haircut. The kind of confidence that usually comes from inheriting success instead of earning it. Without making eye contact, he pointed toward the trash can. "Can you hurry up with that? We've got clients coming." "Of course," I answered. He finally looked at me. Not at my face, at the uniform. Actually, he gestured toward the coffee station. "My cup's empty." I waited. "So," he frowned as if confused by the question. "Fill it. Not please, not would you mind? Just fill it." I smiled politely. "I'm sorry, sir. I'm here to clean the building." He sighed dramatically. "Unbelievable." He shook his head before muttering loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. No one wants to work anymore." As he walked away, another executive chuckled. The room filled with quiet laughter. None of them knew I had personally written the company's first employee handbook. The very first sentence read, "Every person deserves the same respect, regardless of their position." I remembered typing those words at my kitchen table 15 years earlier. Somewhere along the way, my company had forgotten them. That afternoon, I ate lunch alone in the employee cafeteria. No reserved executive dining room, no catered meals. Just soup and a turkey sandwich. From that small corner table, I watched people far more carefully than they watched me. Engineers thanked cafeteria workers. Interns held doors open for security guards. Customer support representatives cleaned their own tables before leaving. Good people still existed. That mattered, because bad leadership doesn't erase good employees. It simply exhausts them. Then I noticed something else. Every time the CEO entered a room, conversations stopped instantly. Not out of admiration, out of fear. I've led enough organizations to recognize the difference. Respect makes people stand taller. Fear makes them go quiet. Late that afternoon, I pushed my cart toward the executive boardroom. The weekly leadership meeting had just ended. The door opened. Executives streamed into the hallway laughing about quarterly bonuses. One of them stopped beside me. Without asking, he handed me his empty coffee cup. "Make sure this room's spotless." I accepted the cup. "Certainly." As the hallway emptied, I stepped inside. The boardroom overlooked the entire city. 15 years earlier, I had stood in this very room with 12 folding chairs and one whiteboard balanced against the wall. Back then, every decision felt personal because every employee felt like family. Now the polished walnut table seemed colder somehow. Success had made the room larger, but not warmer. I slowly wiped fingerprints from the glass wall. Then my eyes landed on a document someone had forgotten to collect. Across the top, in bold letters, were 6 words that instantly made my stomach tighten. Confidential. Founder Equity Transition Plan. I hadn't approved any transition plan. In fact, there wasn't supposed to be one. I picked up the first page, and before I finished reading the opening paragraph, I understood that my 6-week undercover experiment had just become something much bigger. Someone inside my own company wasn't just disrespecting the cleaning staff, they were preparing for a future where the founder would never come back. I didn't touch the document for several seconds. Instead, I looked around the boardroom to make sure no one was coming back. The hallway had gone quiet. Only the faint hum of the elevators echoed through the executive floor. I closed the door behind me and returned to the conference table. The document was still lying exactly where the last executive had left it, as casually as if it were tomorrow's lunch menu instead of a confidential corporate strategy. The title alone made my chest tighten. Founder Equity Transition Plan. I slowly sat down in the chair at the very end of the table, the same seat I used to occupy during every board meeting before stepping away. For just a moment, 15 years disappeared. I could almost hear the voices of the original team. People who believed in impossible ideas. People who celebrated landing our very first client by ordering cheap pizza because none of us could afford anything better. Back then, every dollar mattered. Every employee mattered. Every decision carried someone's dream. Now, someone had left confidential documents scattered across the boardroom without a second thought. That wasn't carelessness. That was arrogance. I opened the first page. The proposal wasn't signed, but I recognized the formatting immediately. It had come from the Executive Strategy Office. The opening paragraph read, "In anticipation of the founder's permanent retirement, ownership restructuring should be accelerated to ensure uninterrupted executive authority." Permanent retirement? I frowned. No one had discussed permanent retirement with me. Not my attorney, not the chairman, certainly not the board. I continued reading. Each paragraph made my expression grow colder. There were recommendations to dilute my voting power through newly issued executive shares, suggestions to revise the company's bylaws, language designed to make every proposal sound routine, legal, responsible. It wasn't an outright theft. It was something far more dangerous, a quiet transfer of influence, the kind that happens while everyone insists they're acting in the company's best interest. If I hadn't decided to spend 6 weeks pushing a janitor's cart through my own headquarters, I might never have seen it. I carefully returned every page exactly where I had found it. Then I took out the small notebook I carried inside my cleaning apron. Most people assumed it contained supply inventories. It actually contained observations, times, names, conversations, patterns. For 3 weeks, I had been documenting everything. Now I added one more entry: Boardroom, confidential equity transition proposal, unauthorized, investigate authorship. I slipped the notebook away just as voices approached outside. The executives were coming back. I grabbed my spray bottle and began wiping the glass wall as though I had never stopped working. The door opened. 3 senior vice presidents walked inside, laughing. One of them glanced toward me. "Still here? I'll only be another minute." He sighed dramatically. "Try not to touch the presentation screens. Last cleaner almost messed up the calibration." I nodded politely. "I understand." He never acknowledged me again. Instead, they began discussing next quarter's leadership bonuses as though I were part of the furniture. And the CEO wants another performance review. Mostly department heads. "What about operations?" "They're already cutting staff." One executive laughed. "They always complain. They'll survive." The words settled heavily in the room. When I founded Hayes Dynamics, layoffs had always been the absolute last option. We reduced executive salaries before asking hourly workers to sacrifice theirs. Apparently, that philosophy had disappeared with me. I quietly pushed my cart into the hallway. No one noticed me leave. That afternoon, I worked several lower floors: accounting, human resources, customer support. The atmosphere changed dramatically depending on where I went. Customer support looked exhausted. People skipped lunch to answer overflowing phone queues. The break room refrigerator was almost empty. Someone had taped a handwritten note above the coffee maker: "Please save supplies for everyone." Simple, respectful, nothing like the executive floor upstairs where expensive catered lunches disappeared half-eaten every afternoon. Companies reveal their priorities through small things. Not speeches, not mission statements, coffee, time, attention, respect. Around 3 o'clock, I entered the maintenance supply room to replace empty paper towel boxes. A familiar voice surprised me. "You don't have to carry those by yourself." I turned. A young maintenance technician hurried toward me. He couldn't have been older than 25. His name tag read Ethan. Without waiting for permission, he lifted the heavier box onto his shoulder. "I've got it." "Thank you." He smiled. "My mom would kill me if she found out I let someone your age carry that much weight." I laughed. "So your mother raised you well." "She tried." Together, we walked toward the elevators. Unlike almost everyone else in the building, Ethan spoke to me instead of at me. "What did you do before this job?" The question caught me off guard. No executive had asked me anything about myself in 3 weeks. "I've spent most of my life building businesses." He looked impressed. "Really? A small one?" He grinned. "Still counts." We reached the storage closet. As he stacked the supplies inside, he shrugged. "I actually like working here." "But," he hesitated, "but it doesn't feel like the stories people tell." "What stories?" "You know, the founder. They say she knew everybody's name. They say she'd eat lunch with interns. They say she answered customer emails herself." I stayed very still. "And what do people say now?" He looked around before lowering his voice. "They say nobody upstairs cares anymore." Those words hurt far more than the equity proposal, because documents could be corrected. Culture was harder to rebuild. Before leaving, Ethan smiled again. "If you ever need help moving supplies, just ask." "I appreciate that." After he disappeared down the hallway, I stood alone beside my cart for several moments. 3 weeks, hundreds of employees, dozens of executives. Only one person had asked whether I needed help. Only one. As evening approached, most employees packed up to go home. The executive floor, however, remained brightly lit. Another closed-door meeting, another strategy session, another conversation hidden behind glass walls. I emptied trash bins outside the conference room while pretending not to notice anything. Then one sentence drifted through the partially open door. "She's never coming back." Another voice answered confidently. "Exactly. We just need the board to make it official." I froze. There was only one she they could possibly mean: me. For the first time since putting on the cleaning uniform, I realized this was no longer simply an undercover audit. Someone wasn't waiting for my retirement. Someone was actively planning my disappearance from the company I had built with my own hands. And before this was over, I intended to find out exactly who was leading the plan. The next morning, I arrived before sunrise. Old habits die hard. For 15 years, I had always been the first person in the building. Apparently, that had changed too. The lobby lights were still dim when I signed in as Margaret, collected my cleaning cart, and stepped into the elevator. There was something strangely comforting about an empty office. No ringing phones, no rehearsed smiles, no meetings, just the quiet sound of a company waking up. Sometimes silence tells you more than conversation ever can. I decided to start on the executive floor again, not because it needed cleaning, because it needed watching. As I polished the glass outside the CEO's office, I noticed movement inside. The lights were already on. It was barely 6:30. Interesting. The CEO, Richard Lawson, usually didn't arrive until after 8. At least, that's what the calendar report said. Today, he was almost 2 hours early. He wasn't alone. Another man stood across the desk. I recognized him immediately. Nathan Cole, Chief Financial Officer. I had interviewed Nathan myself nearly 8 years earlier. Back then, he had impressed me. Quiet, methodical, brilliant with numbers. He had promised me something during his final interview. I'll always protect this company's future. Looking through the office window now, I wondered whose future he had meant. I couldn't hear every word, only fragments. Board votes, timing, legal exposure. Before anyone knows. Richard suddenly noticed me outside. He walked to the door and opened it sharply. "What are you doing?" I held up the spray bottle. "Cleaning the windows." He looked annoyed. "This office doesn't need cleaning until after business hours." "My schedule says every Tuesday morning." "I don't care what your schedule says." His voice stayed perfectly calm. That almost made it worse. "Find another floor." I lowered my eyes politely. "Yes, sir." As I turned away, I caught Nathan watching me, not dismissively, curiously, as though something about me seemed familiar. Only for a second. Then the door closed. I continued down the hallway. Never rush after hearing something suspicious. People remember panic. They ignore routine. By 9 o'clock, the building had transformed. Employees poured through the lobby carrying coffee cups and laptop bags. Conversations echoed across every hallway. Most ignored me. Some smiled. Others looked straight through me. I had started keeping quiet mental notes. Not about performance, about character. Who thanked receptionists, who held elevators, who returned shopping carts in the parking garage. Leadership begins long before someone receives a title. Around mid-morning, I was cleaning near the marketing department when I heard raised voices. Not shouting, something colder, embarrassment. I followed the sound toward a cluster of workstations. Richard Lawson stood over a young analyst whose face had gone completely pale. I asked for one report. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. And somehow, he lifted several printed pages. "This is what you bring me." The analyst swallowed hard. I can correct it." Richard didn't even glance at him. "No." He dropped the papers across the desk. "You'll stay tonight. Cancel your plans. I expect competence." Without another word, he walked away. The entire department remained silent. No one defended the young man. No one even looked at him. They simply lowered their eyes and returned to work. Fear had become normal. I slowly rolled my cleaning cart closer. The analyst rubbed both hands across his face. "You okay?" I asked softly. He forced a smile. "I've been better." I handed him a fresh cup of coffee from the nearby station. "Here." He blinked. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." For the first time all morning. He smiled. "Thank you." His badge read, Daniel Kim, 26 years old, probably working 60-hour weeks, trying desperately not to lose a job. I remembered dozens of Daniels over the years. Bright people who only needed someone to believe in them. Fear doesn't create excellence. It creates survival. There's a difference. Just before lunch, I witnessed something else. A delivery driver arrived carrying several large boxes. The receptionist stood up immediately to help. So did 2 interns, before they could reach the lobby. Richard stepped out of the executive elevator. He frowned. "Why are the interns doing this?" The receptionist answered carefully. "They're helping. They weren't hired to move boxes." His eyes shifted toward the delivery driver. "Facilities should handle it." Then he looked directly at me. "You," he pointed. "Take care of it." The boxes were heavy, very heavy. The interns looked uncomfortable. One of them whispered, "We can help." Richard answered before I could. I gave an instruction. Nobody moved. I quietly lifted the first box. Then another. Then another. Years of ranch work had taught me more than most people expected. Still, the point wasn't whether I could carry them. It was that no one with authority cared whether I should. As I reached the storage room, someone grabbed the final box before I could. Ethan. Again. "I've got this one." "You sure?" He laughed. "Pretty sure." Together we stacked everything neatly. He shook his head. "I don't understand this place anymore." "What do you mean?" "My grandfather worked here. He used to tell me stories about the founder." I stayed silent. "They said she built this company on one rule." "What rule?" He smiled. "No job is beneath the person asking someone else to do it." My throat tightened. I'd said those exact words during our 10th company anniversary. Not because they sounded good, because I believed them. Apparently. Some people still remembered, even if leadership didn't. That afternoon, Linda called. Not my office, my disposable prepaid phone, the only number she knew for my undercover assignment. "Everything okay?" she asked. "No," I answered honestly. "It's worse than I imagined." There was a pause. "What happened?" "I haven't found corruption yet." "I've found something more dangerous." "What?" "They've stopped seeing people." Silence filled the line. Linda understood immediately. Numbers can be repaired. Policies can be rewritten. Culture is much harder. Before hanging up, she said quietly, "The chairman wants an update. Tell him not yet." "You found something?" "I think the equity plan is only the surface." "You believe there's more?" I looked through the hallway windows toward Richard's office. He stood inside laughing with Nathan, completely relaxed, completely confident. "Yes," I said. "And whoever's behind this believes they've already won." I ended the call. As I slipped the phone back into my apron pocket, my eyes landed on a white envelope sticking halfway out of the CEO's office trash bin. Most people would have walked past it. I didn't. The envelope had been torn in half. Across the visible portion, I could still read 3 words: Private Acquisition Proposal. Someone had tried to destroy it, but not well enough. And something told me. The real reason they wanted the founder out of the company had nothing to do with retirement. It had everything to do with what they planned to do once I was gone. I left the envelope exactly where I had found it. Every instinct I had told me to take it. Every year of experience told me not to. People notice missing evidence. They rarely notice evidence that remains exactly where they left it. Instead, I memorized everything I could. The company logo printed in the upper corner, the legal firm's return address, the handwritten initials in blue ink. R.L. Richard Lawson. There was no doubt about that. Someone had torn the envelope apart in a hurry. Someone who believed the cleaning lady wouldn't think twice before throwing it away. They were wrong. I quietly replaced it inside the trash bin exactly as I had found it and continued emptying the rest of the office. When I reached Richard's desk, something else caught my attention. A framed photograph. It hadn't been there the previous week. Richard stood in the center, smiling beside several investors at what looked like a luxury golf resort. Nothing unusual about that, except one familiar face standing beside him. Victor Monroe, the CEO of Apex Industrial, Hayes Dynamics' biggest competitor. For years, Apex had tried to buy us. For years, I had refused. We weren't for sale. Never had been. Never would be. Yet here was my CEO posing like old friends with the very man who had spent a decade trying to acquire my company. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe it meant everything. I added another note to my little notebook before moving on. Around lunchtime, I decided to eat outside. There was a small public park across the street from headquarters, where employees often spent their breaks. It was one of my favorite decisions when we designed the campus. I wanted people to leave the building, to breathe, to remember there was a world beyond deadlines. I carried my sandwich to an empty bench. A few minutes later, someone asked, "Mind if I sit here?" It was Daniel. The young analyst Richard had humiliated the day before. Not at all. He smiled gratefully and sat beside me. For a while, neither of us spoke. Sometimes silence is more comfortable than forced conversation. Finally, he laughed. "I guess we're both hiding from the office." "I suppose we are." He stared at his unopened lunch. "My wife keeps telling me I should quit." "Will you?" He shook his head. "I can't. We just had our first baby. I need the paycheck." His voice carried the exhaustion of someone trying very hard not to fall apart. I used to love working here. What changed? He smiled sadly. I don't think the company changed overnight. I think, he searched for the words, the people at the top stopped listening. That sentence stayed with me, not because it was dramatic, because it was honest. People don't leave companies. They leave leaders. Before heading back inside, Daniel thanked me for listening. You know, he said, I've talked more to you this week than to my own manager all month. I smiled. I hope things get better. So do I. As he walked away, I wondered how many talented people we were quietly losing simply because no one bothered to hear them. The afternoon brought another surprise. Linda texted my prepaid phone. Chairman is visiting tomorrow. Unscheduled. That wasn't normal. Board chairmen don't simply stop by, especially without notifying the executive team. Unless they were checking something or someone. I slipped the phone away just as Ethan rounded the corner carrying a toolbox. Perfect timing. He said, I need help reaching an air vent. You picked the wrong person. He laughed. You don't look like someone who backs away from ladders. Together, we climbed into one of the storage areas above the executive hallway. Dust covered everything. The ventilation system hadn't been cleaned properly in months. That surprised me. When companies ignore invisible maintenance, they usually ignore invisible people too. As Ethan removed one of the vent covers, something slid across the metal duct with a soft scraping sound. He frowned. What's that? A thick manila folder slowly emerged from inside the vent. Neither of us spoke. It was wrapped inside a clear plastic sleeve as though someone wanted to protect it. Ethan looked confused. Why would anyone hide paperwork up there? Good question. He handed it to me. I'll take it downstairs. Before I could answer, a sharp voice echoed down the hallway. Ethan? Richard. We both looked down. The CEO stood beneath the ladder, his expression unreadable. What exactly are you doing? Cleaning the vents, Ethan answered. Richard's eyes shifted to the folder in my hands. For just 1 second. His face changed. It was subtle. Most people would have missed it. I didn't. Surprise, then concern, then immediate control. What folder is that? Ethan looked at me. I found it inside the air duct. Richard climbed the first few steps of the ladder much faster than seemed necessary. Let me see. His hand reached toward the folder before either of us could react. I passed it to him without hesitation. He opened the cover. His shoulders visibly relaxed. Oh, he laughed. Just old renovation blueprints. He closed it almost immediately. I'll take care of these. Something about that felt wrong. Very wrong. Renovation blueprints don't make CEOs panic. They don't get hidden inside ventilation ducts. And they certainly don't need to be snatched away within seconds. Richard forced a smile toward Ethan. Thanks for finding them. Then he looked at me. You can both get back to work. We climbed down the ladder. Richard walked away carrying the folder tucked tightly under his arm. Neither Ethan nor I spoke until he disappeared around the corner. Finally, Ethan whispered, That was strange. It was. You don't think those were really blueprints, do you? I looked toward the executive offices where Richard had vanished. No, I answered quietly. I don't. That evening, after almost everyone had gone home, I sat alone in the empty cafeteria with my notebook open. Over 4 weeks, one pattern had become impossible to ignore. The executives treated people according to job titles. The best employees treated people according to character. That difference explained almost everything that had gone wrong inside Hayes Dynamics. Then my phone vibrated again. It was Linda. Only 3 words. Change of plans. A second message followed immediately. The board meeting has been moved to Monday. Monday? It wasn't supposed to happen for another 3 weeks. Someone was accelerating the timetable, which meant one thing. Whatever Richard and his inner circle were planning, they were almost ready to put it into motion. And unless I uncovered the truth before Monday morning, the next person walking into that boardroom might no longer own the company she had spent 15 years building. Monday was only 4 days away. Whatever Richard Lawson was planning, he no longer felt the need to hide his urgency. Neither did I. But there was one rule I refused to break. I would not expose myself until I understood the entire picture. Half-truths destroy good decisions. I'd learned that lesson decades earlier. I arrived just after 6 the next morning and began cleaning the lobby before the first employees came through the revolving doors. The receptionist's desk was still empty. Her shift started at 7. By the time she arrived, I had already finished polishing the marble floor. She smiled the moment she saw me. "Good morning, Margaret." Her name was Olivia, probably 28, always dressed professionally, always the first person to greet every employee who entered the building. I'd been quietly watching her for weeks. She greeted interns exactly the same way she greeted board members, with the same smile, the same kindness. That mattered. Character isn't revealed by how people treat their superiors. It's revealed by how they treat people who can do nothing for them. "Morning," I answered. She noticed the fresh coffee in my hand. I made too much. She reached into her drawer and pulled out a clean paper cup. "Would you like some?" I laughed softly. "You're offering me coffee from your own pot?" She shrugged. "My grandmother always said the first cup tastes better when you don't drink it alone." For a moment, I couldn't speak. 15 years ago, I had said almost those exact words during our very first employee orientation. Back then, we only had 11 people. We couldn't afford expensive coffee machines, so every morning someone made one large pot, and nobody drank until everyone had arrived. Not because it was company policy, because it was who we were. Apparently, someone had passed that tradition along, even after all these years. "Thank you," I said. "I'd like that." We stood behind the reception desk for several quiet minutes, talking about ordinary things. The weather, traffic, her rescue dog. Nothing important. And somehow, everything important. Because genuine leadership is built in ordinary conversations. Not speeches, not presentations. Just before the morning rush began, Olivia lowered her voice. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Have you ever met Victoria Hayes?" The question caught me by surprise. "I've heard of her." Olivia smiled. "I wish I had." "They say she remembered birthdays." "They say she answered emails herself." "They say she visited employees in the hospital." She laughed nervously. "Honestly, I don't even know if those stories are true." I looked through the lobby toward the bronze company logo mounted on the wall. "They're true." She smiled. "I hope so." It sounds like this place used to feel different. Used to. That word lingered in my mind long after the conversation ended. Around 9 o'clock, Richard arrived. His pace was faster than usual, his expression tighter. He walked straight through the lobby without acknowledging anyone. Not security, not reception. Not the employees who greeted him. Olivia quietly whispered after he disappeared into the executive elevator. "He hasn't said good morning to anyone in months." Small observation, big meaning. People often think culture changes during board meetings. It doesn't. It changes in elevators, in hallways, in greetings people stop giving. Late that morning, I received my biggest surprise yet. The chairman himself walked into headquarters. Harold Bennett. 74 years old, white hair, navy suit, former Marine. One of the few people outside my attorney who knew exactly why I was undercover. We had agreed beforehand that he would pretend not to recognize me. As he entered the lobby, I kept my head down, wiping fingerprints from the glass entrance. Richard hurried downstairs almost immediately. "Harold." Richard extended his hand enthusiastically. "This is a surprise. I was in the neighborhood." The chairman smiled pleasantly. "Thought I'd stop by." "I wish we'd known." "I prefer surprises." Richard laughed. "I'm sure you do." The two men began walking toward the executive elevators. Then something unexpected happened. Harold stopped, turned around, walked directly toward me. For one terrifying second, I thought he had forgotten the plan. Instead, he looked at the wet floor beside my cart. "You've done an excellent job." He smiled warmly. "Thank you." I nodded politely. "My pleasure, sir." He walked away without another word. Richard looked confused. Very confused. I noticed it immediately. Executives often reveal themselves through what surprises them. Apparently. The chairman thanking a cleaning lady was one of those surprises. The afternoon passed quietly. Too quietly. The executive floor felt different. Doors stayed closed. Conversations became whispers. Every few minutes, someone carried folders into Richard's office. No one smiled. No one lingered. The building itself seemed to be holding its breath. Around 3 o'clock, Ethan found me replacing supplies in the maintenance closet. "You've got to see this." "What happened?" He handed me a printed work order. Look at today's maintenance requests. I scanned the page. Most were ordinary. Lighting, air filters, conference room projector. Then one line caught my attention. Archive storage, basement level B4. Requested access, CEO authorization. Only I frowned. B4? I didn't even know we had a basement level B4. Ethan nodded. Almost nobody does. It was the original records archive before everything became digital. Nobody's used it in years. My pulse quickened. Original records, corporate records, ownership files, founding documents, board resolutions. Exactly the kind of place someone might visit if they wanted history to disappear. When was the request submitted? This morning. By Richard? Ethan nodded slowly. Personally. I handed the paper back. Has anyone gone down there yet? No. He scheduled it for tonight. Tonight. Not during business hours, not with witnesses. That wasn't routine maintenance. That was secrecy. At 6:30 that evening, the building was nearly empty. Most employees had gone home. The executive floor lights were still on. I quietly rolled my cleaning cart toward the service elevator. No cameras covered the inside. I pressed the button for the lowest basement level. B4. The elevator descended longer than I expected. The doors finally opened onto a narrow concrete hallway lit by old fluorescent fixtures. Dust covered the floor, metal shelving stretched into the darkness. Thousands of archived boxes lined the walls. It smelled like old paper and forgotten history. I moved silently. Somewhere ahead, voices. Richard. Nathan. And another man I didn't recognize. I stepped behind a row of storage shelves just as Richard spoke. Once these files are gone, there's nothing left to challenge the transfer. The second man answered quietly. And the founder. Richard laughed. She's retired. By the time anyone realizes what's happened, the company won't legally belong to her anymore. I felt my grip tighten around the cleaning cart. For weeks, I had suspected greed. Now I knew the truth. This wasn't about running Hayes Dynamics. It was about stealing it. Then Nathan said something that made my heart stop. What about the original shareholder agreement? Richard smiled. We're destroying it tonight. And for the first time since walking into my own headquarters, disguised as a cleaning lady, I realized I wasn't just investigating my company anymore. I was about to witness a crime. I stayed perfectly still. The concrete pillar hid me from view, but only barely. On the other side of the archive room, Richard, Nathan, and the third man stood around a steel table covered with old binders and cardboard file boxes. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Everything about the room felt forgotten, which was exactly why they had chosen it. People don't hide the truth in crowded places. They hide it where no one thinks to look. Richard pulled on a pair of white archive gloves. If we're going to do this, he said, let's finish it tonight. The third man unlocked one of the gray filing cabinets with a small brass key. He removed a thick leather binder. Even from where I stood, I recognized it immediately. The original corporate record book. I hadn't seen it in years. When Hayes Dynamics was founded, every major decision had been documented there before the company transitioned to digital records. Inside that binder were the original shareholder agreements, the first board resolutions, my signature, the company's history. It wasn't just paperwork, it was proof. Nathan opened the binder carefully. There it is. He slid out a cream-colored document. The edges had yellowed with age. Richard smiled. The original ownership agreement. He tapped the paper with one finger. This is the only version that still gives Victoria absolute voting control. The third man looked nervous. Are you sure about this? Richard answered without hesitation. Once it's gone, every digital copy becomes the official record. Nathan hesitated. What if someone asks for the original? Richard laughed. They won't. They don't even know this archive exists. I felt my heart beat slow. Not from fear, from certainty. For the first time, I knew exactly what they intended. They weren't forging my ownership. They were trying to erase the evidence that proved it. There was a difference, a very important one, because I knew something they didn't. 15 years earlier, my attorney had insisted on creating 3 original signed shareholder agreements. One stayed in company archives, one remained in his law firm's vault. The third, I had placed in a private safety deposit box under my own name. Richard believed he was destroying the only original. He was wrong, but I wasn't going to tell him that. Not yet. Sometimes the fastest way to expose a dishonest person is to let them believe they've succeeded. Richard placed the document into a portable shredder positioned beside the table. Nathan shifted uncomfortably. "We're really doing this?" Richard looked at him. "You like your stock options?" Nathan nodded slowly. "You enjoy your executive bonus?" Another nod. "Then stop worrying." He switched on the machine. The motor hummed to life. For a brief moment. The original shareholder agreement that had launched my company disappeared into the blades. Thin white strips fell into the collection bin below. Richard exhaled. "Done." He actually smiled. "Now there's no going back." No, there wasn't. Just not for the reason he believed, because the moment that document disappeared, his actions became impossible to explain as a misunderstanding. This was no longer unethical. It was intentional, deliberate, criminal. The third man locked the archive cabinet again. "What about the remaining files?" Richard glanced toward another stack of boxes. "Take anything related to early ownership. If it mentions Victoria having controlling authority, destroy it." They worked for nearly 20 minutes. Board minutes. Early investment agreements. Original amendments. Some went into shredder bins. Others disappeared into sealed boxes marked for confidential disposal. I memorized every movement, every document number I could read, every person who touched the files. Not because I intended to stop them, because I intended to prove exactly who had done it. Eventually, Richard checked his watch. "That should be enough." He looked around the archive one last time. "Let's get out of here." The three men disappeared down the hallway. Their footsteps echoed until silence returned. I counted to 60, then another 60. Only when I was certain they were gone did I step out from behind the shelving. The room looked untouched. Except it wasn't. History had been ripped apart one page at a time. I walked slowly toward the shredder. Most people assume shredded paper is useless. It isn't. Not immediately. The collection bin was still full. Long white strips lay neatly inside. I carefully lifted the entire waste container from the machine and examined it. Many strips were still aligned. The company seal remained visible across several pieces. The signatures had been sliced, not pulverized. Interesting. Very interesting. I smiled despite myself. Richard had been in such a hurry that he'd used an ordinary office shredder, not an industrial destruction system. A forensic reconstruction specialist could piece much of it back together. Old habits resurfaced. I removed a heavy-duty evidence bag from my cleaning cart. Years ago, I had stocked every janitorial cart with spare disposal bags. Today, one of them became something much more valuable. I transferred every strip of paper into the bag. Then I replaced the empty shredder bin exactly as I had found it. If Richard checked tomorrow morning, he would assume the cleaning crew had emptied it overnight. Routine. Invisible. Exactly what he expected. I looked around the archive one last time. One shelf near the back seemed oddly cleaner than the others. Dust covered everything, except a small rectangular space. Something had been sitting there recently. Something about the size of another record binder. I crouched lower. There were faint drag marks leading toward the wall. Not the exit. The wall. I ran my fingers along the concrete blocks until one felt different. Smoother. Newer. My pulse quickened. Someone had repaired a section of the wall. Very recently. Not enough time to investigate now, but enough to remember. I wrote one sentence in my notebook. Check repaired wall in B4. As I slipped the notebook away, my prepaid phone vibrated. A message from Linda. Chairman confirmed. Monday's board meeting starts at 9:00 a.m. I checked the time. Friday evening, that gave me only one weekend, one chance. If I was going to expose Richard Lawson, I needed proof so overwhelming that no board member could deny it. As I pushed my cleaning cart back toward the service elevator, I couldn't help thinking about something my father used to tell me whenever we faced impossible odds. The truth has one advantage over every lie. It never has to remember what it said. Richard believed he had erased my history. Instead, he had just given me the evidence that would destroy his future. And he still had no idea that the cleaning lady he had ignored for 6 weeks was the only person standing between him and the company he thought he had already stolen.